Do you think substances like magic mushrooms, psilocybin, will assist with this in the future? We seem to see this happening just like marijuana and cannabis is being accepted more widely throughout the nation. Do you think this might be opening up for this?
I think it's a very rich area of experiment. I think it's very important. We need accelerants. I mean, we live under terrible stressors, perhaps every generation has, but there is an eagerness on the part of the public. There's an eagerness on the part of the individuals, certainly something I feel myself, to find accelerants. And I think there's research that demonstrates that when dealing with addiction, when dealing with PTSD, we have accelerants. Entheogenic or psychedelic substances may be one of those. Cannabis may be one of those. Certain forms of meditation, certainly transcendental meditation is one of those. So I think the search for accelerants is really important in our time.
One might say we're products of our environment, and our experiences is what shape us. What happened to you in Belize about 20 years ago?
Oh, I visited the nation of Belize twice. I really love Belize. It's, of course, a Latin American nation on the Pacific. Beautiful, beautiful country. English is the most widely spoken language there, although Spanish is, of course, also spoken. And I was in Belize some years ago, and my travel companion and I were headed up to an eco resort way up in the highlands, and we were bouncing on this unpaved dirt road stretching up a mountain, and the cab driver began to say to us, as soon as he dropped us off at this jungle lodge that we were visiting, he was going to just make a sharp turn right out of there and be gone. And I said, why? What's the rush? And he said, well, there are these little men, Aleutians, who occupy the hills. You know, in Ireland they might call them leprechauns. Somewhere else they might call them fairies. There's a different term in the nations of West and Central Africa. And I thought he was just trying to play scare the tourist. The next day we were canoeing down this very quiet, snaking river that was going through, passing between these ravines. It was a narrow river. And I began to say how I didn't like that cabbie trying to scare us yesterday, and I started talking about this, and then suddenly, in the dead quiet from out of nowhere, this boulder came crashing down the hill and landed in the water maybe about 12 feet in front of us. And one of the tenets of belief is that if you talk about the Aleutians or the little people, they come around and they can do mischief. And so I thought to myself, well, I better button my lip. I'm a guest here, and I need to respect local custom and outlook. And a lot of people in the nation, very forthright, very together, very canny, spoke to me and shared stories about these little men who were said to occupy the hills. And I got interested in it because every culture throughout human history, including to the present day, from Polynesia to Siberia, literally, has these tenets of folklore. And I believe in treading very gently around folklore.
Is it in Belize or somewhere else that you mentioned they call them the others to avoid any conflict with them?
Say again, please. I lost you there.
Yes, I believe you said something. I'm not sure if it was in Belize or somewhere else where you have to call them the others, not with the name.
Yeah, that's in Ireland. They refer to. People won't walk around using words like fairies or leprechauns very often, at least the people with traditional beliefs. The people with traditional beliefs refer to the other crowd. That's their euphemism, the other crowd, because the feeling is, again, that if you talk about them, they'll come around and do mischief. And a friend of mine, a folklorist named Eddie Lenihan, actually succeeded in getting a planned highway rerouted in County Clare because the construction plans required the highway to bulldoze what was known as a fairy bush, which is supposed to be a domain of the other crowd or the little people. And Eddie felt that this would result in traffic accidents or other tragedies or mishaps. And there were enough people who agreed with him so that local authorities did agree to route the highway around the fairy bush, and it still stands.
That's interesting. Has science ever, because I know we live in a materialist world where, and we'll discuss this later, we need to see things on radar, we need to see tangible evidence. But when it comes to fairies, when it comes to all these creatures, has science ever studied this at all?
That's a good question. I would say probably not. There's lots of testimony, and I take testimony very seriously. A critic would say I'm talking about anecdote, but the difference between anecdote and testimony is usually a person's belief system. And when you amass testimony over many, many years, it does become a record. We use testimony all the time. We use it in medicine. We use it in therapy. There are drugs, the efficacy of which we don't really fully understand, sometimes psychopharmacological drugs, sometimes drugs that abet pain resistance, and we use the testimony of the patient to decide whether the treatment is effective. So I take testimony very seriously in matters of all walks of life.
Mitch, when I started this program almost 15 years ago, when the topic of UFOs and extraterrestrials was still ridiculed, but there are some of us who knew it was only a matter of time before this topic was going to be taken seriously. In 2019, you attended an event at the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, a venue not considered a place for occult passions. It hosted a panel on UFOs and extraterrestrials. One of the participants was our friend, philosopher and historian Dr. Diana Pasulka. And at one point, the curator asked you, at what point do you think it is going to become intellectually embarrassing within our culture not to make seriously the question of UFOs? Mitch, I'm interested in your answer and also the motivation for such an event to have taken place at such a non-traditional venue for the topic being discussed.
Well, it was interesting. The curator and the organizer of that event is a man named Troy Therian. And Troy is no longer with the Guggenheim, but he had curated a hugely successful and popular exhibit there that featured the paintings of Hilma af Klint, who was a theosophist and was inspired by the occult cosmology of Madame H.P. Blavatsky, the founder of that movement, the co-founder of that movement in the late 19th century. And that probably gave Troy, who's a brilliant curator, some degree of clout within the institution. It was a huge critical and public success. And he assembled a panel, as you referenced, in late summer of 2019 to discuss the UFO question. And he approached me afterwards and he asked the question that you just repeated, when do you think it's going to become intellectually embarrassing in our culture not to take the UFO thesis seriously? And I stopped and I thought for a moment and I said, honestly, right now, with articles featuring high-def video from Navy cockpits, radar images that appeared starting in 2017 in the New York Times by Leslie Cooper, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper, and these things continuing, these articles continuing for a couple of years, and the panel being held at the Guggenheim to a standing room only crowd. You should have seen the auditorium. I mean, you couldn't pack another soul in there without the fire marshal visiting. And I realized that we had hit a point where the UFO question has gone mainstream. No serious person in our culture can just wave this stuff off. It's swamp gas, little green men, you're imagining things, you're drinking, you're delusional. Clearly there's some kind of engineered phenomena that we're unable to understand. And this question is, it's not only mainstream at this point, but it's going like a freight train. The news, I believe, is going to keep coming. To the extent that the past prophesies the future, we're going to see a continued unfoldment of this question, continued evidence, and obviously continued debate. But I couldn't have imagined 5 years ago the extent to which this would go mainstream. I don't think there's anyone of any real serious intellectual gravity in our culture, any journalist of really serious credentials who would feel at ease just dismissing this as a bunch of fairy dust and nonsense. The culture has changed.
It certainly has. I have friends who many years ago would laugh at the fact that I study this subject. And even last week, some of them are sending me pictures. Like, what do you think? Do you think this is true? And I'm thinking, really? Now you're sending that to me for serious consideration? But Mitch, we've had many luminaries on this program. Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher, from Berkeley's Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Dr. Claude Swanson from MIT and author of The Science of the Paranormal. They have both passed away and left a great legacy for newcomers to continue. But these were trained scientists who delved into this, may I say, forbidden topic. We discussed the Princeton eggs, and I believe the Princeton lab was closed not too long ago. What and why do you think has pushed most physical and ESP-related psychical, and ESP-related research off the college campuses?
Well, since the 1970s, since the early 1970s, there has risen in the U.S. primarily a professional skeptic apparatus. And their sole mission, their sole dedication is to discredit parapsychology, discredit the study of events, testimony, evidence for things that are not commonly observed. And they've been very successful. They're good at sound bites. They're good at spiking reference sources like Wikipedia. They're good at employing language that seeks to discredit the researcher, him or herself. They use a lot of superlatives and hyperbole, and it resonates. And they've been, unfortunately, in my view, they've been very successful. And hence, we used to have ESP labs at universities like Duke and Princeton. There were studies going on at Harvard and Cornell, and to a great extent on college campuses, but not entirely. That's been curtailed because it's very hard for these researchers to get funding, even though the experiments themselves are really inexpensive. They're peanuts compared to what gets spent in psychology, the social sciences, and so forth. And they also go after individuals, and they seek to smear and discredit the reputations of individual clinicians and researchers who are trying to undertake this work. So I think we've probably lost about a generation of progress in the academic study of ESP, with some wonderful exceptions, including experiments that now go back about 10 years at Cornell into precognition or retrocausality, which is one of the most exciting vistas of study to emerge from the field recently. But it has stymied the research, and it's a real tragedy for our culture. I can't emphasize enough how relatively inexpensive this research is, how careful and meticulous its academic followers, clinicians, pursuers are. They're well aware of the damage that could be done to their reputation. They're well aware of the problems of fraud, and they have elevated their standards very high, partly to overcome some of the natural resistance involved. And it's very tough for these people to raise money, and I'd like to see that situation turn around.
I can think of the Monroe Institute, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and others. And I know you know Dr. Dean Radin. What keeps these entities alive these days?
Well, these entities have to do their own private fundraising. And anybody who's written grant proposals knows that writing a grant proposal is a career in and of itself. And it's extraordinary to me, the clinicians who have soldiered on in this environment, because they have to raise money privately, they have to do their research, obviously, they have to write up their research, subject it to peer review. A lot of these papers that are produced are reproduced in mainstream social science or psychological journals, subjected to intense scrutiny, partly because of the subject matter, and that's fine, that's as it ought to be. And sometimes they also have to hold down their day jobs. They might hold academic positions or clinical positions in other labs, and they're doing all this at once, and they're managing to make it work. They're some of the most stalwart clinical researchers that are out there today. I'm
thinking of Dr. David Jacobs, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who recently passed away, who deal with the abduction phenomena and the UFOs. These are serious researchers. One in UPenn, I forgot where Dr. Leo Sprinkle used to be a professor at, but they used to take time out of the professorship to deal with this. And at least Dr. Leo Sprinkle, he was sanctioned by the university. He was told to stop when he was doing this, helping people from all over the world. What do you think, academia, what is the stand today? Are they pro looking outside the spectrum, or are they just want to stay mainstream?
It really depends field by field. There's, oddly enough, there's more sympathy in medicine and the hard sciences for ESP research, for parapsychology, than there is in the social sciences. The social sciences, to a very great extent, has gotten into a kind of defensive cultural crouch where they've aligned themselves, and I'm speaking generally, of course, there are exceptions to this, but the field academically has aligned itself to the materialist outlook, feels challenged by anything that's considered transpersonal, extraphysical, parapsychological. You actually find greater sympathy among physicists and medical professionals than you do within the social sciences, but that's frequently the departmental affiliation that people have who want to study this material, because parapsychology has for many years been seen as a branch of psychology. It's the part of the root of its term. And there's a lot of intellectual rejectionism around the topic, and that makes it all the more difficult on campuses.
Well, I think parapsychology is still a very, very popular when you go, well, if you go to physical bookstores, if they're still around, they have large sections of parapsychology, and you see that in sales and so on. So the hunger for this kind of, we can call it knowledge, is out there. But you mentioned, social media that's being used to ridicule, to shun a lot of these people who are out there trying to research. Something comes to mind. Somebody passed away recently, the amazing Randy. Mm-hmm. Amazing Randy. I believe you did a magnificent takedown of the amazing Randy. He was the co-founder of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, there's a piece collected in Uncertain Places called The Man Who Destroyed Skepticism, which is a piece that I wrote as a kind of a counter-obituary to eulogies that were being written for Randy when he passed away a little over 2 years ago. And I was extremely critical in the piece. I'm not someone who wants to write so-called takedown pieces. I'm not someone who gets a charge out of challenging people's reputations, but I felt that James was responsible for a lot of very cheapened pseudo-skepticism that has swept through our culture and authentically misinformed people. For example, when James was living, he produced a teacher's guide, a guide for grade school teachers, to teach children, grade school kids, about ESP if they had questions. And it's riddled with unreferenced inaccuracies, one of which stated that the pioneer of ESP studies in America, J.B. Rhine, didn't count null sets, didn't count negative sets. Not only is that outright false, but in fact, in the early 1930s, when J.B. opened the parapsychology lab at Duke University, he not only instituted a practice of reporting all data, of leaving nothing tucked away in the file drawer, so to speak, but at that time, it was fairly common practice in the social sciences in this country not to report negative sets, maybe under the spurious justification that, well, something must have been wrong with the methodology. And it was an unethical and problematic practice, which JB reversed for the entire field. He led the way for the social sciences in general to get away from the practice of withholding negative sets. And in fact, in 1940, JB and his colleagues at Duke performed the first meta-analysis of statistically based ESP studies and analyzed every single set of legit studies that they could lay their hands on, including unpublished studies. And the term meta-analysis didn't even exist until 1976, and JB led the field in that direction as well. After decades in the media, James knew this. and he directly misrepresented JB's work in this teacher's guide without sourcing. This is the state of so-called skepticism. These practices have come to run riot across that field as a professional expression pursuit. And I think he was a terrible influence on our culture. I wrote the piece with a heavy heart because I'm aware that we all have friends, loved ones, family ties, and I have no interest in casting aspersion on anybody personally, but insofar as he was a public figure, he did a true disservice to intellectual inquiry, which is why the piece was so critical.
I'm looking at a lawsuit here from 1995, I believe. Uri Geller versus James Randi. You probably heard about that lawsuit back then, didn't you?
Yeah, well, those two, they feuded for years and years and years, and I never really looked into the particulars of it. I was, personally speaking, more concerned with the manner in which James misrepresented studies, research, misinformed school teachers, and smeared the reputations of very legitimate, often private researchers who were just doing their best to raise money and do their work in an ethical atmosphere.
Do you think he was just trying to debunk regardless? Do you think deep inside maybe he did believe, but he had been at this for so long that he needed to keep his skeptic persona?
Well, it's an interesting question. I noticed that these debates really are emotionally charged. They're debates of sentiment rather than of statistics, rather than of scientific methodology. And that happens with most of our debates. This has poisoned most of our policy discussions. It's certainly poisoned the waters of public discussion around parapsychology. There's a very strong team mentality, a very strong partisan mentality. It's all emotional. And I must say, I debate with skeptics. I believe that there should be a robust skeptical review of this material, but it's very difficult to find people to debate with on a level worthy of the name because the emotions run so wild that James and other professional skeptics would just soon flip over the chessboard than actually see through the study, see through the inquiry. I've often said that sometimes when dealing with such people, I hit my limits of understanding human nature. We could all engage in armchair psychoanalysis about why people do what they do, why we resist rational information, which is something that the skeptics feel is their sword and shield. They feel they're the ones defending rationality, and yet they not infrequently use duplicitous means to do so. This is on display on Wikipedia, for example. Wikipedia is, in some respects, a wonderful information resource, but in areas of parapsychology, coteries of skeptics have figured out how to spike the punch bowl, so to speak, and they go on Wikipedia and make claims, sometimes sourced to more or less one publishing house in Buffalo, New York, called Prometheus Books, and probably a plurality of their sources are reference to Prometheus Publications, which is a highly partisan, professionally skeptical aligned publishing company, so it's like just referencing yourself in your own paper, basically. And they spike these pages, and it's very hard for the public to get reliable information, and that includes journalists who are on a deadline, who are doing a Google search into ESP research, and in all likelihood, the first 5 results that are going to come up, which is usually all anybody looks at, are partisan-baked, skeptically skewed results. I use the term skeptic generously. In some cases, the term pseudo-skeptic is more appropriate.
I think there should be balance. There should be a filter to get rid of the charlatans, but some make it their goal to become professional debunkers. What's your take on Michael Zerber? Michael
is a talented intellectual pugilist, but he has spread himself too thin, and his interest spread so far and wide in the direction of anything that he thinks reeks of pseudoscience, a term that through overuse has almost lost all meaning, that I think at times he too gets into a similar position to the one James was in, where he's debunking almost for the purpose of emotion and team sentiment rather than really exploring. And I respect Michael, and I think he can do better.
I think the term pseudoscience, almost like conspiracy theorist after JFK's assassination, that was the term that was coined for anybody that questioned that. But pseudoscience is the derogatory name for anybody who wants to look outside the spectrum.
Yes, and it's problematic. Look, we lose important terms in our culture all the time because of overuse. You know, people will throw around a word like cult, for example, which colloquially in our usage today in the 21st century means an abusive, isolating, belief-based organization. A cult is not something that I or another person finds weird. You know, we have words for that, and we have to be careful in throwing these labels around in polemical ways. It does injustice to the language, and we lose them when, in certain cases, they might be warranted.
Let's talk about the occult. I have to say, I'm seeing signs of what you call a third wave occult revival, a la Madame Blavatsky from the late 19th century. Are you seeing that, and what is causing the resurgence?
You know, it's interesting. I used to resist speaking of there being any kind of an occult revival in our time or paradigm shift, because frankly I just didn't see signs of it. Interest in the occult or the extra-physical has been an evergreen on the Western scene for centuries, and there was a big revival in the late 19th century, as you were referencing, in connection with the work of Madame Blavatsky and Eliphas Levi and some other figures. There was another revival in the late 60s, fueled by the Woodstock generation, where interest in Eastern spirituality and an interest in experimenting with alternative forms of living opened people up to various occult and esoteric ideas. Despite the advent of technology, digital technology, and the way that it's made these things accessible, maybe the pipes got bigger, the pipes got broader, but I didn't see any real revival. I do think there's a kind of third wave revival underway right now, and it's because of the mainstreaming of the UFO question in large measure. There are other factors as well, including new experimentation with psychedelics, as you were referencing earlier. But the mainstreaming of the UFO question has been a biggie because that tends to poke holes in the straight story of our just existing in this predictably clockwork box of Newtonian mechanics. The popularization of ideas and theories emerging from quantum mechanics has also been opening people up to questions of the perceptual basis of reality. And this has been converging, I think. These conversations have been converging. There is a lively and interesting debate over whether UFO phenomena might be related to interdimensionality, events crossing into our horizon that emerge from different intersections of time, which at first sounds like a very far out idea, but in fact it's an idea that's been with us since the 1930s, apropos of research into quantum mechanics and the manner in which particles, although not just particles, sometimes larger macro objects as well, behave in surreal ways, behave in a pattern that's sometimes called a wave state, or exists in a state of infinitude until a measurement is taken, and only then does a particle localize. And a great many physicists, including Erwin Schrödinger and Hugh Everett, who pioneered what's called the many worlds theory, have reasoned that because matter, at least on the atomic scale, is in a state of flux, a state of infinitude, until a measurement localizes it, it stands to reason that there's potential events and actual events playing out all around us constantly at once. And when you start to apply that to the UFO question, it's very interesting. Theorists have come up with what is known as string theory, which postulates that everything that is exists along these undulating bands of strings. So something that's happening in another dimension or another intersection of time that we don't witness might be affecting things that go on within our own event horizon, so to speak. And these discussions are very much alive within physics, which may be a reason why, as I was alluding earlier, you find greater sympathy for parapsychology or ESP studies within the hard sciences than you do sometimes within the social sciences. And listen, we've known since the age of Einstein that so-called space-time bends. Time itself, linear time, is not an absolute. It's conceptual. Time bends in conditions of extreme velocity. It bends in conditions of extreme gravity. In our own era, astronauts in our own era, although they're moving nowhere near the velocity of light speed, demonstrate minute reductions in the aging process. So time itself is not what we think it is. Dimensionality itself is not what we think it is. Matter doesn't behave according to the rules it's supposed to. The mind and cognition doesn't behave according to the rules it's supposed to. Not only in ESP research, but as we were talking about earlier, in neuroplasticity. So all this stuff converging together suggests to me a new level of interest, engagement in the extraphysical. Hence, I think it is fair to say that there is a shift going on. I think it's very real. I think we're living through it right now.
You mentioned NASA and the fact that, of course, we haven't conquered speed of light, but I wonder if NASA has people, maybe they're not disclosing this, but looking at certain places around the world, ley lines, Peru comes to mind, Iraq comes to mind, other places that have certain attributes that some people might call a portal or a gateway, where you can actually go through it if a certain atmospheric condition is taking place, to move from point A to point B instantaneously. I wonder if they're looking into that and they're not telling us.
Well, it's interesting. With regard to questions of disclosure, the UFO movement has a very uneasy relationship with the government, NASA, the DoD, and so forth, because there have been efforts at cover-ups in the past, or there have been efforts to smear people who are interested in studying UFOs, and there are various reasons for this, and we know some of this factually thanks to FOIA requests, whistleblowers, other things. It's probably part of the reason why these Navy cockpit videos emerged above ground in 2017. And it's important to remember, and this was actually pointed out by the Stanford immunologist Gary Nolan a few weeks ago. I spoke at a UFO-themed conference with Gary here in New York City, and he's done a lot to study the UFO thesis, and he made the point to the audience, and I think it's really important to remember that there are people who want to squelch disclosure. There are also whistleblowers. There are people who have motives for as many reasons as we have people. And the people who are passionately interested in UFO disclosure can't get into a constant defensive crouch where everything the government does or everything the government says is seen as having some ulterior motive, or seen as some sort of a cover-up, or seen as a distracting excuse for something else. Sometimes, probably, that goes on. And we know historically it has gone on. And sometimes there are earnest whistleblowers, just as we have in media, just as we have in finance, just as we have in government, just as we have, who reveal problems at social media companies who are ignoring their own evidence of abuses that are going on online, or dangers that are present online, sometimes in a very real, concrete way, like flash mobs that are being organized against Muslims in India, which for a while was playing out on Facebook itself, and Facebook had the data, and we know this thanks to whistleblowers. So my point is, there's people who favor squelching information. There's people who favor whistleblowing and shining daylight on information everywhere, in every agency, every business, every walk of life. It's a tension. We have to live with that tension. We have to try to cultivate the best transparency we can, and not be constantly responding from only one place, one perspective, one point of view.
By the way, speaking of UFOs, the owner of an Area 51 website, I believe the website is area51resort.com, which is being wiped from the internet, was raided, no-knock raid by the FBI a few days ago, and all his computers and mobile devices were confiscated. Why do you think that this is becoming so mainstream now, where the media is talking about it all the time, unlike what we used to see 10 years ago?
It's funny, I have not heard that story. I made an effort to visit Area 51, an unsuccessful effort about 18 months ago. Anybody who's driven up the so-called UFO highway and tried to traverse the dirt road leading to Area 51 gets turned around in a big, big hurry, and that happened to me. There were a couple of guys behind sunglasses in an SUV who were less friendly than what I encounter at the Department of Motor Vehicle, and we turned around rather quickly. So I'm not familiar with the events that you were just referencing. But listen, the public in all these areas, parapsychology, ESP, UFOs, there's a widespread conviction among the public, people of all backgrounds, political outlooks, that there's something real there. There's something real there. And because the public believes something is not an adequate measure of truth, I can't emphasize that strongly enough. But the fact is, we are supposed to be living in a society with some degree of transparency and the free flow of information. And if people feel, by and large, that this information is not being adequately shared, that is a legitimate public issue. And that's part of what fuels the coverage.
And by the way, I misspoke. The actual website is dreamlandresort.com. I know it was shut down temporarily, but it's now up again. But Mitch, I think you mentioned this in your book. This is relevant, and at least in the United States it is. Other countries may be more open-minded, but here we are. We're more materialist. We want to see UFOs on radar. We want to see for ourselves. We want to touch. We want tangible evidence. But if we are to rely on science, doesn't science tell us that our visual spectrum is limited and we can't see or hear beyond it? Infrared, ultraviolet, infra, and ultrasound. And I bring this up because I recently heard a previous guest talk about an experience his father had as a helicopter gunner in Vietnam. At the beginning of that war, the United States military had infrared goggles, unlike the ones we have today, which are green. And at one point, they were actually red. And he said his father and others reported seeing strange creatures. And they were actually shooting at them. They became so upset about what they were seeing, if I remember correctly, that the military recalled the goggles and updated them to the green we now have. Have you heard of this story?
I have not, but you're raising a lot of important issues. What's viewed with the naked eye can, of course, be deceptive, and as five sensory beings, we have limitations. The source of the reportage is important. Is it a trained pilot? Is it a trained infantryman? Is it somebody who understands the manner in which aerial objects are supposed to behave? That certainly raises the stakes of the reported phenomena. Do we have some sort of lasting record? Do we have high-def video? Do we have radar? If you marry that to testimony, that raises the stakes. Where there are problems, those problems need to be sorted out. Where there are errors, those errors need to be sorted out, which again is why I authentically want there to be a good skeptical apparatus. I want the same thing in the ESP field. Are there problems with fraud? Are there problems with some kind of researcher bias or something of that nature? Are we able to meta-analyze these results, match them up with other results, or match them up with historical accounts for that matter? So there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done, and none of us can afford, in the pursuit of questions that go beyond common observation, to permit our enthusiasms to get the best of us. And we've all got them. And we're never going to be rid of enthusiasms or confirmation bias, which is just a social science term for prejudice. It gets thrown around a lot. The people who frequently use it don't apply it very much back to themselves, because we all have a position from which we're arguing. So the evidence should be held to a very, very high standard. Testimony matters, but once that testimony is submitted, then the who, what, why, when, and where, and is there supporting evidence, of course, needs to be married to it.
I bet our military, what is it that they used to say that they're ahead of us 50 years. If technology doubles every year and a half, I believe every 18 months, imagine what they have now. If in the 1950s they had missiles that could track a UFO the size of an aircraft carrier, and this was declassified, by the British Ministry of Defense. Imagine what we have now.
It's interesting. We also have, of course, a digital culture where people can look at these things. It's not always a help, but sometimes it is. It's much more persuasive to look at a piece of video than it is to look at a grainy black and white photograph on the front page of a newspaper. And that's a factor as well in all of this. It's very interesting. This question that we're discussing cuts across all political lines. It's one of the very few questions in our culture that does. And that, too, is probably abetting some kind of disclosure.
And this is why I love this subject, because we can discuss this with somebody from the right or the left, and it doesn't matter. It seems that we can find common ground with this subject. But that brings me to Jacques Vallée, who says UFOs probably are some kind of interdimensional manifestations which enter our awareness intermittently and then vanish again. If we are able to perceive within a certain spectrum, and according to Professor Michio Kaku, who says the multiverse has 11 dimensions, how can we apply the scientific method of observation, replication, and prediction without measuring with our own current equipment?
Well, it's interesting. That's why I'm detecting a convergence between UFO research and parapsychology or ESP research specifically. Theory of interdimensionality, I find a persuasive concept. It's worthy of pursuit. And he maybe wasn't entirely the first person to propose that idea, but he certainly proposed it in the fullest way in the late 1960s, early 70s. And that has become a dominant contender among theories of what's happening. If one restricts the UFO question to the ET thesis versus the interdimensional thesis, and there are other theses as well, such as unknown technology and so forth, that warrant hearing. But we have the problem with the ET thesis is that if an object is traveling from some other part of the galaxy or some other part of the universe as we know it, the distances that would have to be covered are unfathomable. They're literally unfathomable and difficult to even conceive of. So we have certain theories, like cosmic wormholes, for example, that postulate that maybe through the introduction of some exotic element, you could create the equivalent of a black hole where gravity collapses and space-time, as we call it, bends, and you can travel from one intersection of time to another in dramatic fashion. And then we have theories like string theory, which I referenced earlier. I think our conceptual models of interdimensionality are better developed than our conceptual models of possible ways to bend space-time and cover vast, vast distances. Neither of these things are reality. They're just concepts of reality where we're on our knees peeking through a keyhole trying to figure out what's going on. But I do think that we as a human community have better models today of interdimensionality than of the capacity to travel at speeds that surpass light. So that's one of the reasons why I'm sympathetic to Jacques' thesis, and I think he's done so much to move the ball down the field in theorizing about what's going on. The academic study of ESP is also helpful in this regard because it raises the question of whether the psyche itself is capable of traveling among different intersections of time. Earlier, I made reference to experiments in precognition at Cornell University that were conducted by a clinical psychologist named Darrell Bem. He published his results in a very mainstream juried psychology journal in 2011. And in short, Bem found that activities that you take in the so-called future can improve performance in the so-called present. And I say so-called because we're witnessing what might be referred to as retrocausality. We're witnessing exceptions to linearity. And BEM's statistical data has been rigorously meta-analyzed, pooled with other similar studies, and been found confirmatory. And I write about this extensively in my book, Daydream Believer, and elsewhere. And that raises the question of whether the psyche itself, under certain conditions or at certain times, is capable of receiving information or being affected by activities that go outside our common linear perspective. It's part of the same conversation indirectly as string theory, and it's very exciting. So it could be that some of our capacity to take measurements, some of our capacity to at least statistically map out experiences that might be interdimensional in nature are abetted by academic ESP research. So that's one of the reasons why I really want to see that research occurring in a better atmosphere of funding, in a more, I would say, well-developed atmosphere of intellectual inquiry, where people who raise these questions in academic settings are not hooted down or laughed down, because all these considerations, I think, are starting to converge.
And I think there have been experiments proving precognition and synchronicity. I mean, the what do you call it? The eggs in the Princeton eggs with
Yes.
random numbers.
Yes.
So isn't there enough data to take this seriously?
There is certainly enough data to take it seriously. We have statistical data as good as any that we possess that speak to the capacity of the mind to receive and transmit, so to speak, information in a way that goes beyond any known cognitive or technological function. The data is out there. It's been replicated, juried, meta-analyzed. It's proven bulletproof. We have statistical evidence for ESP that is as good as any statistical evidence that we've got. So there's either a flaw in our scientific model that we haven't come to terms with, or the rejection of the evidence is simply anti-intellectualism. And I've seen signs, most of the latter. And that is a problem for inquiry. You can smash Galileo's telescope, but you can't make what you're seeing through it go away. And I think, as I said earlier, we've lost a lot of progress, at least a generation of progress probably, in parapsychology. And we have to do better. We as a culture have to.